You're listening to WonderLabs, filling your ears with nerdy goodness. Earholes.
Hello, and welcome to WonderLabs. I'm Chris Richardson.
And I'm Ellie Mackay.
In this episode, we speak with Shivani Hassard. Shivani is a researcher at Queen Mary University of London exploring virtual reality, with a specific focus on game design and human-computer interaction. Shivani also has a background in theatre and physics, a great combination for someone working in this evolving space.
We managed to clear up some misconceptions, including virtual versus augmented reality and presence versus immersion. And we also explore experimental design and the importance of self-reported and physiological data. We also discuss the potential end of cinema and the notion of VR game designers as architects of space as opposed to authors of time.
Shivani is a fascinating polymath, pulling on many threads for inspiration.
This discussion was a real virtual rollercoaster, and we hope you enjoy the ride.
So Shivani, just to kick things off, can you tell us a bit about yourself and your background?
Well, I've worked as a filmmaker for the last 5 or 6 years, working mainly in lighting and in camera. So I'm interested in technologies and images and the way we create images and the meaning of those images. I also have a background in physics. I did a physics degree at UCL, partly because I was fascinated by time, I was fascinated by free will and a lot of kind of philosophical areas around that. But then at the end of the day, I also just really liked physics and wanted to get a really strong background in it. Kind of putting those two together, as I got a bit older, I figured out that perhaps a PhD would be for me, and I started a PhD at Queen Mary's researching virtual reality.
When I was talking to Ellie about this as well, I described you as this Renaissance woman who's pulling on a lot of different threads and drawing a lot of different inspiration from sciences and art, and I think the kind of collision of those worlds coinciding with the actual advances that are happening in VR at the moment, it's perfect timing for someone like you to step into it.
Yeah, do you think that because you've had a background in a very artistic and non-scientific field, do you think that you bring something else to the game?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess from working in virtual reality and from going to a lot of different events and meeting a lot of people, I have met quite a few filmmakers. I've also met quite a lot of theatre makers, and actually theatre is actually probably more useful in terms of designing stories than film is. And I definitely don't think it's just classical computer science nerds in virtual reality at all. I think a lot of people are attracted to it from the arts.
Because it's all about representing reality, which is what storytelling and theatre and film and music even is all about. Really.
Yeah, and as is a lot of physics and as a lot of chemistry and biology actually. And I would say that that's probably a much better, concise reason why I wanted to go into physics, was because I was interested in representing reality. Thank you for summarising my rambling earlier. Basically, that's effectively it. Yeah. And I think people who do theatre and film, there's a certain form that the medium has that is a more literal account of reality.
So when you went from physics into camera and lighting, how did you find that transition? And then how did you find the transition sideways, I suppose, into VR?
I think it's a difficult comparison in the sense that I started working in film when I was 17. You know, my mother's an artist, a brilliant artist, and I've been her studio assistant since I'm a child. I think I've had grounding in the art. She raised me as an assistant, very practically.
Very useful.
So coming on to you then, and virtual reality, which is what we're here for. Could you define virtual reality for us, what it means to you, and then maybe contrast that with augmented reality?
Yeah, absolutely. So my definition of virtual reality is a medium which replaces the sensory experiences that we take in through sensory organs with artificial data which mimics reality in a sense that we are perhaps able to distinguish but will still react to as though it is reality.
Essentially, you're trying to trick the brain to react in the same way that it would to those sense organs.
Exactly, yeah.
Right. So the best virtual reality, you wouldn't be able to distinguish between reality and VR?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think there's a lot of confusion around what is virtual reality versus augmented reality versus mixed reality. And I think the simplest, almost clear way I can talk about that is in the sense of what is happening to your present signals you're receiving from actuality. And so if you're receiving signals from actuality that are informing your perception of what's happening, as well as virtual signals that are combined and interacting with each other, in that case, it's augmented reality. Virtual reality is something that completely replaces your sensory
so you're
information.
lying in a pod somewhere, Matrix style, and your body is not physically receiving any outside signals.
Yeah, but of course, when I put on a virtual reality headset, if someone touches my arm, I'm still going to feel that.
Well, that was my question, is like, when you're completely immersed in a virtual zone, zone, then what happens to the importance of the external and the person who's maybe monitoring you or has to wake you up after? That can be incredibly jarring, can't it?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think at the moment, you will say, I say totality of sensory information. Obviously, I mean within the remit of what the experience is trying to deliver. Most commercial virtual reality on the market at the moment will be replacing visual data and auditory data. And then slightly more expensive or slightly more complete virtual reality will also have sense of touch, so you'll have tactile feedback, and that is an additional sense. However, there's very few sense of smell virtual reality.
Sure.
However, that's a very obvious next step, and definitely there are several different companies that are approaching that. And in terms of touch, yes, fine, you have controllers, that is not the entirety of your body. However, your brain is able to mimic quite a lot of the gap that would be there.
With traditional forms of media, like the cinema, you have this suspension of disbelief. You have to just sort of accept this reality with which you're presented in order to engage with that particular narrative that's unfolding. With VR, it almost seems like there is the potential to move beyond a state where you no longer have to suspend your disbelief because you are so engrossed in whatever it is that's going on. With that in mind, this concept of presence that you're interested in, can you talk about what presence means?
For me, there's a huge confusion I've seen in people between the definitions of presence and immersion. Starting off with immersion, just to clarify that before going into presence. Immersion itself is also a relatively confusing topic and actually is a huge area within my PhD that I'm researching in terms of breaking it out into different components. Immersion in the virtual reality technical definition would be seen as something that is delivered by the hardware itself, well, the combination of hardware and software. So it's a technical ability of the headset. You could actually define an immersive capability of a hardware, whereas you wouldn't necessarily be able to know how present someone feels before they try the experience.
You can say, well, this new, X5000 headset will create this level of immersion, but you don't know
the subjective level of presence that person has.
Exactly.
And going on to talking about measuring presence, that's a whole other kettle of fish, but possible in certain ways. However, yes, as you say, immersion is something that you can qualify. The other thing that I think is also interesting is that immersion also has a relationship with content, and certain academics will make the distinction between content and form and will say actually immersion has nothing to do with content, it is purely to do with form. I argue something slightly different in that in the experience of receiving content you are not separating it out with form, you're only experiencing it as one package, really.
We talked earlier about theatre as a medium of representing reality. Would you say that immersion is more like the set dressing and the staging and the costumes and the framing, whereas the presence is then how the actors use the space?
That's actually a very good analogy, and also that actually shows the gaps in the definition. Because if you hear it in the context of theatre, you can see how that is quite reductive actually. However, that is the equivalent to what we're talking about, because when we're talking about that with virtual reality, we're talking about field of view, we're talking about latency, we're talking about, as I say, the tech specs of what you're able to deliver. So the definition of presence that I quite like is the illusion of non-mediation within a mediated environment. A mediated environment will be one where there is a medium, namely in this context there is a virtual environment being delivered to you. However, the illusion on mediation means that you're receiving that mediated environment as though it were non-mediated. So you're experiencing a virtual environment and you're responding to it as though it is actual.
I came over to participate in one of your studies. So we did a few different exercises. One without the VR headset that was just a jigsaw puzzle, which I saw as a control almost, and then it was a series of different experiences with the VR headset on, which to me felt like increasing levels of interaction and engagement. And then you were measuring heart rate, blood pressure, and self-reported measures of presence.
So these exercises are like very simple tasks that you're doing?
There were a range. I think the first one was acrobatics. It was, I think, Cirque du Soleil, and it was a video. The next was Ghost in the Shell, where you could perform certain functions. And then the final activity was this fully immersive video game where you have to solve puzzles and move around different maps and environments and things.
And when you say move around, are you physically walking around in the room?
Swiveling in a chair, and then you were sort of measuring different metrics around that. Could you maybe talk us through the process, how you came to that set of questions, that set of experiences, and what exactly you were hoping to get out of that?
My research is looking into different design techniques for creating agency and interactivity within narrative virtual reality. I'm interested in the shape of stories within virtual reality, the way in which, coming from a kind of more traditional medium such as film, right? And coming from a medium where you do have a large amount of narrative control and directorial control, to a medium which is much more like gaming, in which people will be able to interact with the medium in the way that they choose, much more so than in film. I'm interested in looking at what affordances you can give players so that they feel like they have full agency and interactivity when maybe they're on a directed story.
Again, you're tricking them from a sensory point of view to believe that what they're seeing and hearing and then eventually smelling and touching is real, but you're also then giving them a sense of autonomy. So it's not actually about giving them total autonomy, it's giving them the perception of their own autonomy.
One of my questions in my research is around the idea of autonomy and agency.
Okay.
And one of the contributors to immersion is something that is described as challenge-based immersion. Okay. And so when I said immersion itself is also multifaceted, that's one of the facets of it, is the idea that you have this technical immersion, which is like field of view, latency, etc. But then you also have challenge-based immersion, which is basically how active you are in the outcome of what you're perceiving. And so if you feel invested in something, you have a certain level of immersion that we experience in everyday life. Like when you put loads of work into something, you care a lot more how it turns out, right?
Of course. Yeah.
It's a very simple analogy, right? But looking at gamers who feel like they have a much stronger investment and therefore much deeper immersion than people who watch films, I believe that is partly due to challenge-based immersion, which is something that is very well researched and very clear in gaming theory, which is that when you see an outcome to your actions, you feel emotionally invested in that.
Right.
So it's the idea of something being rewarding.
Yeah, that's basically it. And also there's a huge field of research into difficulty, for example, right? There's idea around flow, which is the idea that you put a certain amount of effort in and you're getting a certain amount of reward, and that relationship will shift based on the difficulty of a game. And so there's a whole area of research that I'm only peripheral to, which is looking at how to create the exact right level of immersion based on that reward effort balance.
Amazing.
So how do you think that translates into real life then? Because essentially I as a person could choose to have life on easy mode and just sit back and kick back, or I could push myself insanely hard.
Are there people for whom VR wouldn't work because they wouldn't commit to the investment in that immersion?
That's a really good question. I think, well, with the study that Chris participated in, part of what I was looking at was actually just the range within 30 participants and their level of investment and engagement in this media. Part of the reason I chose those 3 experiences that Chris mentioned is that they have very different levels of engagement and require different levels of effort.
I imagine, Chris, you were enjoying every next stage and wanting to do more and more and get more involved, right?
I think so. My experiencing self at the time versus my narrating self looking back on it and how I actually feel about it. When I was sort of fully immersed in puzzles and having to really engage myself with it, I felt more present and in the moment, whereas if I was just blindly watching something, I was a lot less likely to have any attachment to that experience or wish to return to it. You're still in the process of analysing that data. What are you expecting to see and how are you expecting that will help shape future research questions?
Right, so yeah, I was taking this study as a first study for my future research. Effectively, I was actually started off by designing the study in order to create a solid way to measure presence within my future studies. And so measuring presence is something that is very widely researched, and presence is a hugely researched area within virtual reality for, I think, relatively obvious reasons. I think establishing presence within a virtual environment is critical for the enjoyment of it, I would argue, and people find it fascinating, so a lot of research goes into it. However, a lot of the research that I've seen tends to, after the fact, ask people how they felt, and so the use of questionnaires is huge. There are biometric techniques as well, which is what I was using. So I was using a mixture of questionnaires and biometrics. And I'm not the first person to do this, of course. However, what I was trying to do was to see the relationship between galvanic skin response, which is a kind of sweat level basically, and heart rate. So both are monitored using wearable devices.
Sure.
And I was trying to correlate or see to what extent I could match those up with self-reporting.
I'm always really interested in scientific studies that use qualitative data and try and combine that with quantitative, and how you kind of marry those two together.
That's a great question. So part of the design of the study was because I was not that satisfied with the current way in which people are reporting presence in terms of questionnaires. To me, it's incredibly counterintuitive to ask someone how present they felt in the past tense because it's like it's a very
that's true. I hadn't thought about the irony of that actually.
It's quite funny. I mean,
how aware are people of their own presence? I mean, Chris, probably you skip down the street feeling very consciously present, but I'm not sure how your 30 participants, have they ever been asked before, how present do you feel?
So, you touched on a really interesting point. So as the West turns its gaze more toward Eastern philosophy and meditation practice and mindfulness very much entering the mainstream, I feel that presence is something that is very much on people's consciousness now. It's kind of there. I wonder how, as you said, that would differ between people that are supposedly self-aware.
Yeah, I mean, this is actually a funny thing that I was finding in my research, is that, first of all, phrasing is critical.
Sure.
And especially when you're trying to communicate something that is perhaps a term people don't think about in everyday life, as you say. And also self-selectively, the kinds of people who go to studies, it's very different to everyone else. Like, you know, I recruited luckily a range of ages and luckily a range of backgrounds. I say luckily just because that is often not the case in small studies, small psychological studies. They tend to always be university students who are white, who are privileged, who are usually male. Those people also should be tested fine, but it doesn't really give you any kind of say around the general population, right? I wouldn't say my sample was perfect, but definitely self-selectively, I noticed a huge trend in people who came were people who wanted to chat to me afterwards about their experience of meditation, or chat to me afterwards about their experience of presence in everyday life.
So these are people who are already questioning their own sense of presence in actual reality.
Oh, completely.
And so then they're comparing that to their impression of presence in virtual reality.
Because, you know, why else would you go to a study where I'm, you know, I'm feeding you cake, but you're not really getting much else for it, right?
Wait, was there cake?
You didn't get any cake.
Oh no! Whoops.
I should have early as well.
Have some biscuit.
So homemade flapjack.
And I suppose though that in a way doesn't matter that the only kind of people that would come to your study are the kind of people that would be seeking that out, because presumably in the future the populations who would buy into virtual reality would be those same populations.
That's a good point actually. I mean, I would just say that I am conscious of that going forward in terms of making any kind of generalizations. I think, as you say though, going forward with virtual reality, I think it is quite safe to say that because it is not yet accessible to the mainstream, and because it requires a certain amount of hardware that you have to purchase, or a certain amount of time investment, and a certain amount of isolation from social activity, you do have a certain kind of person who wants to do that.
The isolation from social activity, I think, is a really interesting point. This idea that these can be quite isolating experiences, I think when you create a true cyberspace where you can have this high degree of interactivity, you could almost use technologies like this as a way to bridge the sense of isolation that seems to be pervading society right now.
Contrary to that though, I do feel like there's always this argument, isn't there, with the idea of people who are retreating from the real world and then immersing themselves in the virtual world. And if you're talking about creating a sense of VR that is indistinguishable from reality, what impact does that have on our connections in real life?
Well, okay, so I see the argument on both sides. I'm not a scaremonger and I'm not worried about virtual reality in that sense. We talk about virtual reality products as experiences, which is, I think, actually a very contemporary phenomenon, because everything is packaged as an experience nowadays, right?
Sure.
Like, you know, everything kind of has this interactive element to it.
Sure.
No one wants to have a passive engagement with something.
Will we be telling our grandchildren that we used to just sit in a room and have a film played into our eyeballs and that was it? You said about skin and sweating and heart rate and so on. I know when I go to the cinema, my heart rate increases and I might sweat or have pupil dilation or whatever the physical response is, as well as having that qualitative sense of presence. I would say, it was like I was in the film. So if we're shifting to this interactive mode, is this going to be the end of cinema as we know it?
I think there are a couple of different questions in there.
Sorry.
So I'll start. No, that's great, and they're all super interesting. So I'm going to start with the physiological response thing you're talking about, because that kind of relates to my study actually. Using the idea of stress level as a metric for presence is obviously not a direct relationship. There's an indirect relationship between the two. And my argument is that depending on the content you're experiencing and the quality and what is going on in that content, you can say, yes, fine, you expect to be stressed at this moment based on what you're looking at. However, in a peaceful experience, you might not show any stress level. However, you might feel incredibly present in that environment. And so there is a kind of twofold way of measuring that. And as you say, when you're experiencing cinema, the suspension disbelief that you actively engage in order to feel present in the film will be very different to one in virtual reality.
To link back to my plethora of questions from earlier, as a filmmaker, I'm obviously interested in the interactivity that's afforded by VR. All these years we've had this idea of the viewer being a participant in the story, and VR obviously allows that. How does that change narrative storytelling from a film and experiential point of view for the viewer, as it were, because they're no longer a viewer?
I mean, I know that text-based computer games before graphics cards, you know, the earliest computer games actually, they were the games where you could read a couple sentences and then choose to turn right or left on a tunnel, and this was a huge community of computer gamers. And then once the graphics card came out, these text-based games seemed very, very basic and seemed very primitive. And what's funny is that based on some people's accounts of this, what happens when images got involved was that we've spent the next 30-40 years trying to recreate that level of immersion by adding a dimension of of realism, and that realism, I'm saying with quotation marks, is due to this added layer of information, which is visuals, right? And actually, going back to the suspension of disbelief idea, these text-based games were, some people would say, the highest level of immersion, because there was challenge-based immersion, but there was also all the effort you put in terms of imagining the space, and you were effectively creating your perfect environment, and so of course you're immersed in it.
Which is the same argument that people like to read a book.
Yeah, and answering your question from a while ago, you're saying about the end of film and theatre, and I think using books as a very obvious example, we have fewer and fewer people engaging with each particular medium as one moves forward. However, of course, it does not replace it because you're getting completely different things from it. I personally really like the idea that there's an inverse relationship between engagement and effort, in the sense that when you're putting a lot of effort into imagining a world, whether that's through a series of novels or through theatre where you suspend disbelief a lot more than in film, I really support the idea that that is related to how immersed you feel in the narrative. That does not mean that you feel a sense of telepresence, it means that you feel a sense of immersion within the story.
How would a director go about making a film where narrative is controlled by the viewer? Do I write 50 different endings, then it's like a tree that branches and branches and branches, and in each stage the viewer makes a decision as to what happens next? Or do you create just a world? What are directors going to be doing in 20, 30, 40 years' time?
You know what, that's literally my PhD, so let's see. I'll tell you in 2 years' time. I'm exploring that exact area and the balance between those two things. What I found within this field is that, as you touch on, there's an inverse relationship between the stability of a story and the level of interactivity you assign to players, right? Interestingly enough, you were like, oh, I'm going to make branching within stories, right? Sure. Which still, to me, suggests that there is a kind of clear deterministic path that these people would take. There's just a multitude of them.
Yeah, sure.
And then you also contrasted that with this idea of an environment people are interacting with. And what I thought was interesting was, because you're a filmmaker, you perhaps saw the second option as less story-like.
Yes, yeah.
And I appreciate that as
because
well.
If you remove that, then what's the story?
Yeah, true. And actually, there's a huge argument which I really appreciate, that the temporal aspect to a film and the release of certain satisfaction chemicals in your brain will be temporally matched to what is happening to the story you're receiving. That's a huge question mark, to be honest, around narrative storytelling within virtual environments, and something that I think as filmmakers we might need to let go of and then perhaps find in a new way. I've mentioned gaming several times. I think gaming has very successfully done this for decades, right? In the sense that if you imagine the director less so as an author with a direct storyline and more so as an architect of space, you're imbuing space with affordances and meanings. And like in a building, a good architect will know how to design a frame through which people will move. There's a way in which you can shape people's desires based on what is afforded to them as design. There are some people who are doing really interesting things in terms of temporary constraining VR experiences, and there is a trade-off in that they do have to give up a certain amount of interactivity, and that's why I'm saying this is effectively my area of research, which is where does that balance fall? And there are some really great virtual reality experiences that have successfully done this. I just think that a perhaps interesting route to go down as storytellers is to look at spatially designed storylines.
Fantastic. Cool. Really, really cool.
Good place to wrap up the research. We do have a few quick questions. Cool. Go on then. Was
there a moment in your life where you had a eureka? Science is cool, this is for me.
Oh man, science has always been cool.
Yes.
No, I
will always be cool.
I will always be cool. Yeah, I guess I did, and it was probably around physics, because I always really loved physics, and it was about entropy actually, which is a really scary and all-pervasive topic that I got into quite young. And
I got into entropy.
Really heat death of the universe. That stuff's addictive.
Deep.
It's deep.
Fantastic.
Is there an emerging field that excites you at the moment?
I'm really interested in interactive agents within virtual reality. So people who are using natural language processing and machine learning to create effectively chatbots who are characters you can interact with.
Do you have a pet peeve of something that's commonly misunderstood or misrepresented in your industry?
You know what? I have a really big pet peeve on Pokemon Go.
Okay.
Go on,
let's let it out. Let it all out.
No, because the reason why it annoyed me was not because it's a great game, was because people are turning around saying like, oh, well now augmented reality is solved. Like, we've already done augmented reality now.
It's done.
Ta-da.
It done it.
Pikachu has
Go and
solved it all.
enjoy it, yeah.
And I'm like, well, true, it's showing there's an appetite for the word augmented reality. However, it wasn't augmented reality.
So you're going to raise the bar.
And
So that was just scratching the surface for you, and you were...
I mean, no, it was an overlay on your phone. Like, it was... it used your GPS in a way that
Sure.
I mean, like, bear in mind, I love these games. Like, there's huge areas and huge scope for really fantastic gaming, right?
Yeah.
In the physical world. And I really love that aspect of it, but it was not augmented reality in any way.
Do you have a favourite piece of science or tech equipment?
I really like my light meter, which I use in film.
Nice.
Which is great.
What is it about the light meter?
What's about the light meter? Well, your eyes are light meters, and sometimes you're just trying to get reassurance that you know how bright a room is, and it's just genius. It's a fantastic piece of equipment, yeah.
Okay, and then just to finish off, do you have a favourite science or tech joke?
Whoa. Oh my god.
Or any joke, to be fair.
Science or tech?
Okay,
Science
fine.
attack. I'll stick to science attack. Oh my god. Can I WhatsApp voice note it to you later? Hey Chris, I've remembered some science jokes. Sorry about it not being off the bat, but I promise they're worth it. The first one goes like this. And the bartender says, "We don't serve tachyons in here." A tachyon walks into a bar. Do you get it? It's about time travel. Earholes.
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 You were listening? I told you. So I said ears. Ellie's gone for earholes.
It's very visceral. Like,
I love it.
See, that was my reaction.
Robert Winston loved it.
Robert
you know what?
Winston
If it's
loved
good
it.
enough for Robert Winston, it's good enough for me.
And that is what this entire podcast is about.
Perfect.